Much of Jeffrey Epstein's life was a mystery. Questions still surround how he went from a college dropout to a multimillionaire financier to a convicted paedophile, and facing charges of running a sex trafficking ring and coercing numerous underage girls to perform sex acts. He pleaded not guilty, and now many of those questions will never be answered. In the early hours of August 10th, 2019, Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell at New York's Metropolitan Correctional Center, where he was awaiting trial. Authorities called it an apparent suicide. The politically connected financier's death occurred a day after a court unsealed documents alleging new details of sexual abuse claims and associates. At the heart of the documents connected to a 2015 defamation case are allegations by a woman, Virginia Roberts Giuffre, who claimed that Epstein kept her as a teenage sex slave. The accusation echoes similar allegations he had faced for more than a decade.
Epstein is charged in a 2-count indictment, sex trafficking of underage girls. Epstein is alleged to have abused dozens of victims.
So how did we get here? Epstein began his career as a high school math and physics teacher. After failing to finish college, he took a brief job at the prestigious Dalton School in Manhattan at the age of 21. From there, he shifted into the world of investment banking, joining Bear Stearns before moving on to start his own investment firm. But it wasn't until he befriended Leslie Wexner, billionaire and CEO of L Brands in the late 1980s, that his fortune really took off. Although how he got so rich is still very much unknown. There are no public records of his investments, and his clients, besides Wexner, are all a secret. What we do know is that by the 1990s he had managed to accumulate several extravagant properties, including a multiple-story townhouse in Manhattan, a mansion in Palm Beach, a private estate in New Mexico, an apartment in Paris, and a private island in the Caribbean, according to court documents. Soon he was rubbing shoulders with some of the world's wealthiest and most powerful people. It wasn't until 2005 that Epstein's lavish life took a turn. Around this time, he came under investigation by Palm Beach police after accusations surfaced from several underage girls accusing him of offering money for massages and sex acts. As part of a plea deal, Epstein eventually pleaded guilty in 2008 to state prostitution charges and served 13 months. He also registered as a sex offender and paid restitution to the victims identified by the FBI. This controversial agreement was brokered by then U.S. Attorney and now former United States Secretary of Labor, Alexander Acosta. It allowed him to avoid federal charges and a prison sentence.
I understand what the victims say, and I'm not here to try to say that I can stand in their shoes or that I can address their concerns. I'm here to say we did what we did because we wanted to see Epstein go to jail.
Epstein then remained largely out of the headlines until 2018, when the Miami Herald published an investigation which included interviews with more than 60 women who say they were abused by Epstein. That reporting raised more questions about his plea agreement and led the Justice Department to open an investigation into his case.
I am calling on the Department of Justice's Office of Professional Responsibility to make public the results of its review of Acosta's handling of the Epstein case.
In early July, Epstein was jailed after a federal indictment accused him of sex trafficking dozens of underage girls, some as young as 14 years old. He pleaded not guilty to the charges.
The alleged behavior shocks the conscience. And while the charged conduct is from a number of years ago, it is still profoundly important to the many alleged victims.
After his arrest, at least a dozen new victims came forward. On July 23rd, 2019, while awaiting trial, Epstein was found in his Manhattan jail cell with marks on his neck and placed on suicide watch. Less than a week later, Epstein was taken off suicide watch, according to a source familiar with the matter. The morning of August 10th, the Federal Bureau of Prisons announced Epstein's death, saying he had died of an apparent suicide.
The most successful individual in the history of American fashion.
I'm Halston.
His clothes danced with
was appalled, and indeed the whole department was, and frankly, angry, to learn of the MCC's failure to adequately secure this prisoner. We are now learning of serious irregularities at this facility that are deeply concerning and demand a thorough investigation. We will get to the bottom of what happened, and there will be accountability. But let me assure you that this case will continue on against anyone who was complicit with Epstein. Any co-conspirators should not rest easy. The victims deserve justice, and they will get it.
Okay, so that was taken from
Jeffrey Epstein's apparent suicide came less than 24 hours after a landslide
CNN.
damning new details in a newly unsealed court documents. Epstein's recent arrest was the result of intrepid reporting from the Miami Herald's Julie K. Brown, which effectively caused the case to be reopened long after most folks had given up. Julie Brown joins me now. Julie, welcome to Reliable Sources. What was your reaction when you heard the news?
Well, I was pretty stunned, disbelief. It's still a little shocking that something like that could have happened given his high-profile status in the Bureau of Prisons.
Well, I mean, certainly. And to make matters worse, the President of the United States, in a time when conspiracy theories are flying online, seems to be retweeting them. What's the right way to cover that?
Well, I'm not one on conspiracy theories. I think that that's something that I think that, social media is not the place to get your news. Let's put it that way. I mean, a lot of people think that they're getting information on Twitter and on Facebook and other platforms, but really you should be reading a newspaper and you should be really studying things more critically than getting your news from social media.
Well, and it's a new problem to have the President of the United States stirring that pot of disinformation. And we're not going to repeat his allegation because it's baseless. But the real question I want to ask you is, as a journalist, as someone who has been steeped in this story and done more than most in keeping it forwards, what are the questions you still want answers on? Because there are a lot of them.
Well, I think we got to, it's important, of course, to look at what happened here with his suicide, but also I think we got to keep our focus on the victims and on this particular case, which really there's so many avenues that have yet to be investigated on, not only on Epstein himself and the crimes that he committed and what other people might have helped him do and other co-conspirators involved in this, but also on how this whole thing happened back in 2008 and why it happened and whether there's any corruption there to look at. And, myself...
You're talking about the non-prosecution agreement to deal with Alex Acosta.
Yeah, and not only that, but quite frankly, his incarceration. There are a lot of questions about how he was able to. I mean, just like in this particular case, there's a question of whether he was able to manipulate some people in the Bureau of Prisons in order to maybe make them look the other way. I mean, we really don't know. He certainly did that in Florida, and he certainly was able to get special treatment in Florida. And how does that happen? How is it that someone is able to get a work release when you're a sex offender and be able to essentially not be supervised even 100% of the time, to be able to have your own private driver drive you in your own private vehicle to work release and back every day, and to go into an office where you're essentially allowed to have visitors. I mean, how does something like that happen?
New and troubling revelations surrounding the apparent suicide of accused sex trafficker and convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. CNN has now learned that the 66-year-old was supposed to be checked on by guards every 30 minutes since he was taken off suicide watch late July. And that did not happen on the night of his death. Epstein was also supposed to be housed with a cellmate and not left alone. But he was left alone. And we're also learning that both guards that were on duty that night were on overtime, one of them working his 5th overtime shift that week alone. Katie Benner of the New York Times helped break this story, and she's joining me right now. So, Katie, first walk us through these protocols, what you learned about what is supposed to be in place, especially when someone attempts suicide.
Sure, we'll take a step back. Jeff Epstein, as we know, last month he was found in his cell unconscious, and people at BOP were investigating whether or not that was an attempted suicide. In the meantime, he was put on suicide watch. He met with a psychiatric evaluator every day, and then on the 29th, he was taken off of suicide watch. We don't know exactly why that happened, but we just know that best practices for that occasion, that means that he would have a cellmate, it's supposed to be a deterrent for self-harm, and that guards would look into a cell every 30 minutes.
And then his cellmate, he did have one for a period of time, yes. But that cellmate was moved. Do we know the circumstances? Was that supposed to be temporary? Do we know anything about the elapse of time? What's going on there?
So that's one of the things that Bureau of Prisons and the Justice Department, the FBI, and the Justice Department Inspector General are all going to be very curious about, and they're going to investigate. Because as part of the condition of taking him off of suicide watch, the warden at MCC told the Justice Department that this was happening and that the conditions would be a cellmate and periodic check-ins. Now, we don't know exactly why the cellmate was removed, but we do know that immediately upon him being taken off of suicide watch, he was paired with somebody. So things seem to be sort of going apace per usual protocols for a couple of weeks.
I've been a war correspondent for more than 10 years, and every conflict that you can think of, I have never seen.
All right, so let's bring that to an end. And all that came from CNN. Okay, it's not my material. Obviously, it's not my voice. Here is what SouFLoTV have to say, though. Now, if you think about it, this guy is connected to people like the royal family. The royal family. Past presidents. Movie moguls in Hollywood. Epstein's longtime associate was Lex Wexner, the CEO and founder of Brands, the parent company of Victoria's Secret and Bath and Body Works. Okay, so you're not talking about you're talking about someone that rubbed elbows with the elite of the elite. Okay, the people that make stuff go around. I just think that names were coming up in the papers, the documents that were being unsealed. Names were coming up that they just didn't want any more documents unsealed. And if the only way to get rid of all this or to make all this go away was to get rid of him, because once that happened, then the case against him stops. Now, in order for them to go after anybody else, they won't be unsealing sealed documents. They will have to build a case against who they are going to go after. And frankly, all these big names, they have the power to protect themselves, and they just had to give somebody up, and he's the one that they gave up. I mean, he got dirty in the first place, and that's who they gave up. The guy had a private jet that was called Lolita Airways. Lolita meaning underage girls airlines or airways. And on the private jet, it was decked out with beds and everything else. So the action started once they got on it, and the who's who, to including all the big names in the modeling world, were on that jet at some point or another. And the deal was that a lot of these girls, girls young and impressionable, and the deal was that if they came to some of the parties at his mansions or these secret locations and helped to entertain these influential and wealthy people, that it could spin off into a modeling contract for him. Now, what young girl who wants to be a model couldn't see herself doing a Victoria's Secret runway, and you're going to be at the party where the guy who owns Victoria's Secret or the parent company of Victoria's Secret is going to be there, and you're going to be there servicing him? So they were drawn in with all these things, and that's how he got them there. But apparently none of that materialized for them. And of course, years later, they're bitter because his whole accusation was between 2000 and 2005. And we're now in 2019. And whoever was 13 years old then and was being abused then, they sure are speaking up now as adults, right? Leave your comment in the comment section below and tell me what you think happened. I don't think a multi-billionaire just offed himself in a jail cell just like that. I think orders were given and they were carried out. Am I wrong or am I right? There's a conspiracy theory out there before I finish this video, though, that says that that's a body double that we saw leave the prison facility and that his suicide was actually a fake, a hoax, because he is probably off somewhere on a private island. And may I remind you that he did own a private island, not a piece of land, an entire island in the Caribbean. And it was called Epstein Island, named after him. And it was big enough to be an island. And people like Donald Trump and others would vacation there when he was not there and have the whole island to themselves with full staff catering and all of that. So think about that. Is that even possible that he could have just walked out and a body double was used to make us think that he actually committed suicide, and all this is gone away? Leave your comments in the comment section below. SouFLoTV, man. I'm out. Peace.